Everybody, welcome to the Humans and Wildlife Show. I'm your co-host Georgia Terry. This week I'm only joining via this pre-recorded video in the Lunar Valley in Patagonia, Chile. You can see it's quite beautiful, so sorry that I can't be with you all this week, but with you as usual is my co-host Dr. Christian Sase. Christian, what are we going to talk about today?
Okay, I think you should be able to hear me now. I hope that came through that message from my co-host Georgia Oteri. She's in Chile she's on adventures now, wonderful. So I hope that came through okay. So yeah, what are we going to talk about? It's quite a current topic actually. It's a very important topic and I'm really delighted that I got my friend and very knowledgeable expert on wildlife, David Hancock, to join us for this topic. We're going to talk about the recent and current flooding, which is still going on here in the Vancouver mainland. So before we start, I would just like to give you a little bit of background. Hi, David Howden. I see you on. It's very nice that you're there. And everyone on Facebook, I will do everything I can to involve you properly. So just give me a second. I'm going to jump from screen to screen now. And I'm just going to try and share a screen here to show you a map of the lower mainland. 1 second. Just 1 second, David. 1 second. 1 second. 1 second. I'm just. Okay, wait a minute. David just has a problem, but we'll do one step at a time. 1 second, David. 1 second. I'm just going to explain that, and then we'll get to the next part. Okay. So what you see here is a map of the whole region, actually, the whole west coast region, and I'm going to expand it a little bit now, if I can. Technology does, and you'll see there we are surrounded everywhere by mountains in the lower mainland of Vancouver, right? It's all mountains. It goes all the way to Bellingham, in fact, right? And the biggest one being, of course, Mount Baker, and as you know, that creates a lot of glacier water and a lot of rivers. The main one being, of course, the Fraser River, that then that you can see that here that goes via Chilliwack, Abbotsford, and then into Richmond. Into the Pacific, of course, right? And then, of course, there are many other rivers that we're surrounded with. And what has happened here is that this is an incredibly, and David Hancock will allude on that, but it's a very important area for wildlife, and he'll explain to you in a moment why. But you can see, of course, that because of all the settlement that has been going on, there used to be a very big lake there. And I'm going to talk about the big lake here between Abbotsford and Chilliwack. In a place called Barrowtown, and that's where there's a big pump station now. And that area is completely flooded. So I'm going to jump a little bit into the history now of what happened. So, well, flooding in this area hasn't been new, right? So in 1894, there was a massive flood in this area. It was huge. And you can see here in Mission, everything was flooded. It was absolutely devastating. But as more and more European settlers came to settle and build up their farms, they were looking for stability. And that was the reason why a little bit later, that was all during the big flooding. 1 second. Where is I'm just trying to find the screenshot. Yeah, so there was a big lake called the Sumas Lake, right? The Sumas Lake. And it was in that area that I've just shown you. And it crossed right across one of the main highways that we have here, called Highway 1, which is also the Trans-Canada Highway, right? So what they did is they drained the lake completely. It was a massive project. In 1924, they drained it. It took several years to drain it. And of course, when you drain a lake, well, you know that there's a lot of groundwater there. And that groundwater has to go somewhere. All the glacier water that I was just referring to has to go somewhere, right? So what they did, of course, they built pump stations. That's what you do. And first there was the Sumas pump station. And then later it became the Barrow Arrowtown pump station, and here it is. And that is the pump station that is working like crazy at the moment, trying to drain water away from that area, because we've had what they call these atmospheric rivers, a term I, by the way, never heard of, but it sounds absolutely horrific, and it is horrific, and that has completely re-established this lake. And I remember going there with David Hancock recently, just a few months ago, talking, going to the mining area there, to a quarry, and we are talking about the peregrine falcon, and David was saying to me, Christian, did you know this whole area was underwater? And I said, you must be joking. Well, we're not joking. Look what has happened. Just a little while later, just a few months later, we have a major problem. And I couldn't even get back to Vancouver. I had to drive. I was at that just a few weeks ago. I was still in Kelowna, and that is to the east in the mountains, or past the mountains. And I had to drive via the US. It was a 10-hour trip, so I only got back actually 3 days ago. So we are dealing here with a major crisis, and the water is actually still continuing. Now, what is very interesting is actually to talk about the wildlife here. So I'm going to bring in my good friend David Hancock right now, and I'm going to get out of the way here. So David, very nice to have you here, first of all, and thank you for making the time.
My screen says unable to connect to this session.
Well, you are connected. You are connected. I promise you. You're in.
Okay.
All's good. You're all fine. Okay.
Okay. I can't see you or anything. So
Okay.
Okay.
But you're fine. I can see you on the screen. I can see you on YouTube. You're perfectly fine. So just talk and smile. That's all.
Well, I'm good at that. Yeah. Okay. Well, you gave a good introduction to the whole Sumas setting. I would like to take you back a little bit farther than when you started this introduction. I had a fascination with the Sumas Lake going back a long way, because I'd heard tales that this lake formerly was the largest, most productive, and important wildlife area in all northwestern BC, Washington, and so on. It had the biggest numbers, the hundreds of thousands to millions of geese, swans, shorebirds, and particularly cranes and swans. In fact, the early account of this huge Martian lake was when the cranes themselves were flying over. Sometimes it would block out the sun for hours on end. So I started to look into the history of it, and I found a 2-volume history written just way back, about 1868 it was published, and it was by a veterinarian, a Dr. Lord, who was in charge of some 20 horses and mules, who were workhorses and mules of the border people, the people who were doing with sextants and marking out the border between Canada and the United States. And these were all English people. They had been brought out from England to map the border. He had the contract of supplying the horses, carrying all their food and supplies and tents and everything as they worked from Vancouver Island right across Canada to the east coast to plot the border. Mm-hmm. Well, he's gone from Vancouver Island in his first journal and talking marvelous tales about what he sees and talking to the different natives and hearing their different stories. And he goes along in front, literally, because across the road from 200 feet from where I'm sitting right now is a border marker, and he put that in. And so as he got a little bit farther, another 10, 12 miles east of me here, he talks about coming out on top of the ridge, which of course is a moranic ridge. It's all gravel from when the glaciers retreated, but down in the bottom of the valley was this huge lake. And he says it was incredible. He's defining how the flocks of the ducks and the geese and the cranes, they're just, again, blocking out the skies. And he says, then a few minutes later, my goodness, part of this blackout that's coming is mosquitoes.
Oh,
And he says, my horses have just panicked and gone. Well, that's the end of volume 1 of his journals. 18 months later, about 20 months later, he starts again at the same site. And there's just a note that in the meantime, because he literally, with the flood of mosquitoes coming in, the horses panicked. He lost all his horses. He had to walk back to the Fraser River, which was another day and a bit's journey. He had to get on the Beaver, that old boat that the Hudson's Bay Company brought in, went to Victoria, got a 3-mast schooner, and he went down to San Francisco. He bought another 100 horses because he wanted to make it profitable, and he walked them up through California, all Oregon, into Washington, through Washington, and back to British Columbia. And now he starts again. So I always thought his comment but my goodness, there's a horde of mosquitoes and I've lost my horses. That was about an understatement of a lifetime, because it took him 18 months, 20 months to get his horses back, and he had to go walk all the way back with the horses from San Francisco. So it was quite an incredible productivity on this lake of nothing, of mosquitoes at least. So that was my introduction to understanding the meaningfulness of Sumas Lake. And of course, it's those mosquitoes in part, which is what fed all the wildlife that's there. So it makes it pretty easy when you realize that all these migrant ducks, geese, swans, cranes, they're coming out of the Arctic, and they've all bred in the Arctic from Alaska to the Yukon, Northwest Territory, because of one creature. They've all bred up there because of mosquito larvae.
that's incredible,
what
David.
Almost everything young in the Arctic, they live on mosquito larvae. So they have then made this 1,500-mile journey to here, and this is was the first big stopover place. As these millions of birds come out of the Arctic every fall, they would stop at Sumas Lake, regenerate more energy from eating, again, more mosquitoes. And then they would continue on down to the Gulf Coast and Mexico and so on for the winter before coming back. So this was one of the most productive areas for wildlife. Now, he gave another really interesting clue in describing this when he came back, how the native band in the area, actually the only natives in the entire region to live on poled houses. They were out in the middle of the lake, away from the shoreline where the heavy amounts of mosquitoes were. They lived on these houses out on poles, just like we're building houses now for eagles to live in, out on poles. The natives lived on a village that was elevated above the water so that they could keep away from these hordes of mosquitoes. So at least the natives had a way of accommodating to this. The problem for when we started to move Europeans into the area, they didn't like the mosquitoes, and they liked the possibility of there being good soil underneath the marsh. And so that's when, by the 1914 to 1920, they surveyed the whole area, designed the diking system, and in 1920 started to build the dikes. It took 4 years to build the dikes up and start to keep the waters out. And it's done relatively well since then. You indicated about there had been in 1898 a big flood that flooded the whole Fraser Valley area.
1894, that's right. Yes.
That was that was before the dikes were put in for Sumas Lake.
Correct.
After the dikes were put in, there wasn't a major breach of anything until about 1948, when we had one of the 100-year flood periods. This water mainly came down the Fraser, but every once in a while, because you see this little valley in which the Sumas sat is in the Fraser Valley, so it gets whatever is coming down the Fraser next to it. If there's a flood on the Fraser, this valley gets it. But it also had an unusual position that while we're just north of the Canadian-American border, there's a fairly big river just across the border in Washington State called the Nooksack River.
Yes.
And that river
Yes.
used to come down, parallels the BC border, but a few miles inland. But every once in a while, big floods, it would end up rushing north and going into the Sumas instead of going due westward and then going out into the water just south of Blaine, Washington, Bellingham area. So that's what happened this time. We had this very, very heavy rains. We had about 80 inches hit all the mountains in 2 days. And that amount of local water came down not just the Canadian slopes, but it came down the American slopes just next door. And that caused the flood of water to come down the Nooksack. They had their dikes break, and that broke and loose and let the American water all onto the Canadian side. So that started this great flooding. And then, of course, our own waters coming down the Chilliwack River, which becomes the River just before it hits the Fraser.
Right.
And what came off another hill nearby called, it's part of the city of Abbotsford. There's a big hill to the east of it called Sumas Mountain. And all the water coming down that, and over on the south side, the Vedder Mountain, all that water ran into this same valley. And of course, that's what's caused the flooding or the reflooding of the Sumas Prairie, now known as a prairie because it was hopefully dry. But of course, it's made it the Sumas Lake again. And so it's kind of predictable. I mean, it's not. This is not unexpected. It's not hoped for, but it's definitely not expected.
David, I'm just going to bring in a question here from Gentleman Ghost. It's very nice. So I'm just going to interrupt you now and then with some question. He says, I guess this lake was drained but not developed. The pumping station just prevents the lake from reforming. Is it just a dry lake now? That's his question. Yeah.
Well, now it, of course, is a wet lake because it's filled with water again. Yeah. But it had been drained. Mm-hmm. They took that's what the pumping, the diking system and the canals took the water out of the old lake, bled them all into the Fraser River, and then with the dikes prevented it from reflooding. But of course, there was just too much water. Coming down the Vedder Mountain, coming down the Sumas Mountain, coming down, of course, also the Fraser, but particularly coming from the U.S. and the Nooksack River, which flooded, it broke its banks and it ran into Canada instead of staying in the United States. So all that new water simply recreated the old Sumas Lake, which, as I say, is not unexpected. So much of the world's biggest populations of people live in floodplains. I mean, we just do.
That's correct.
It's easier to build a house on level ground, usually level because it was a floodplain. And then at some point, those are all going to flood again. And frequently, as we've been seeing time after time, and down the Mississippi and the different rivers in Texas, and it doesn't matter where you go in the world, it's the same thing. If you live in a floodplain, when there are these rare times when a lot of rain falls from just one possibly cloud, you can get incredible catastrophic floods. You may remember you lived in White Rock near me here a few years ago, and in about a 4-hour period, well, it was actually in about an hour's period, they got 4 inches of rain in White Rock. I didn't get any. I'm only 5 miles from there. I didn't get any rain, but they had a cloud sit over the city of White Rock. And that amount of water just totally flooded out all the bottom land, and all the businesses along the main road were all filled up to about 5-6 feet of water for several
Yeah.
days until they were able to get
Yeah,
dump it
yeah,
all out again.
David, let's talk a little bit also, get some questions here coming in about the
Yep.
impact on the business side. So, what I mean, there's been a flood. There was a flood in 1990 actually, where where Highway One was actually flooded. I'm just going to put. You probably can't see it, but I'm putting the picture in the background. You can see that was part of the highway in Abbotsford that was flooded. Well, from your experience, what is the impact on the business in Vancouver when that happens?
Well, the challenge about the Fraser Valley is that the Fraser River runs right down the middle of it. And there are two main highways that service British Columbia. I mean, there is a highway that goes down into the United States, and there's a smaller road that goes up to the resort area of Whistler that goes north of here. And it will reach around into other parts of British Columbia by a whole bunch of other very, very poor road systems. The main way of getting out of Greater Vancouver is to go up the Fraser River to Hope, and then you go up through the mountains and you go east on the Trans-Canada Highway. But when you get to the bottomland from Hope out to the ocean, there's really only one major highway, and that's Highway 1 right along the south side of the Fraser. There is another smaller highway on the north side. It's called Highway 7, but it's only a windy 2-lane road, and it's not very big at all and not very efficient highway. So when the Fraser floods, or in this case, the Fraser and the Nootsack, they flood basically Highway 1, which is the Trans-Canada Highway. And so they have taken this out of commission for a week or 10 days now. And it's going to be a few more days before they've opened up Highway 1, even in the lower Fraser Valley. Farther east, going up into the Coquihalla area and into the Coast Mountains, there's huge washouts. I mean, they've taken out, some cases, 1/4 miles of the river, of the highway system. And so there's an awful lot of roads. The railways got their two, one of them yesterday, and I think the other one's got its railways again functional, maybe today, on a kind of one-track system. So that's being repaired. But the freeway, the Highway 1 going to join us on Vancouver with Eastern Canada, it's still not going to be very functional for a long time. It'll get one-way traffic and that kind of thing, and then maybe one roadway, one lane on each way eventually, and then the 4-lane highway will reopen and so on. But it's a major loss to the economies of the places along route. I mean, we already, in the gentleman's question about economy, we have already gone on to gas rationing, because there simply is, the gas is either coming in on a pipeline, which was also washed out, or it's trucked in from Alberta. Now, fortunately, we're not that far from Washington and Bellingham, and they have a processing plant for gasoline there, which they take the crude oil from Alaska, from the tar sands of Alaska. That's processed just south of us. So we often have a line of big gas truck tankers bringing fuel from the south into Canada. But that's additional to the pipelines that come down from Alberta's tar sands and bring gas and oil and gas to Vancouver. So there has been huge disruptions of the economy, simply because so much of the basic supply chains have been disrupted. So there you are. And it's going to be disrupted for some time.
Yeah, David, let's jump back to the question about we have the largest wintering concentration of water birds and raptors in Canada, right? So
well, so I have to almost contradict you on that. though
Oh, good. Okay.
I've been telling you that for a long time. We're the raptor capital
Of the world.
of Canada here in the Fraser Valley. Partly because we still have a lot of prey species, but part of the prey species that we now have
Mm-hmm.
evolved are due to the fact that we have this huge valley, and the valley bottoms are filled with grasses and small plants that rodents, particularly microtine rodents, voles and mice and so on, live in. And that's what feeds the red-tailed hawks and the short-eared owls and things like that, the marsh hawks, which we get hundreds of these wintering here. It is the adjacent rivers, all the salmon rivers that come down from the North Shore, these ones that also flooded out, that are the big salmon spawning rivers, and the biggest of all. In fact, the most productive salmon river in all of North America is Harrison River complex, and that comes out right there at Chilliwack, right where this happened, but on the north side of the river. And that happens to be the most productive salmon river in Canada. And all these rivers, we have overfished for the last 100 years, and the numbers of salmon returning year after year has come generally down, 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 down. And of course, because we were the biggest salmon spawning area in all North America, we were also the biggest wintering area for bald eagles, because they are wanting to spend half their year scavenging dead salmon. And they start feeding on dead salmon in the north, late June, when the salmon spawn earlier in the north. And as the salmon spawn farther south, and something else is happening, and that something is the land freezes up. And even there may be dead salmon carcasses under so many of the river, in the rivers. If it's under ice, the eagles can't get at it. So the eagles then come down farther and farther south to get to the Fraser River and the Harrison River. Here is where we do not freeze up. So historically, we've had this 35 to 50,000 eagles from Alaska and northern Canada winter in our Fraser Valley. And so this is the population of eagles that I'm doing another big film on. This population, which we are responsible for feeding them half the year, I think is now in great dire straits of losing its big food supply. It's lost most of its salmon. The birds switched and they converted to eating garbage, because every community has a garbage dump. And now we're processing all the garbage into green bags, and it's going to make soil. So it's no longer providing food for the eagles. So they lost their salmon. Now they've lost their garbage. What are they going to do? Well, they've had 100,000 years of living on salmon. They're going to have to figure out something else. Or, and the or is a big one, or we're going to give them something that we have produced in place of our salmon. And that is a lot of these carcasses of the agricultural industry, the cattle and so on, because there's a huge numbers of cattle now occupying the Fraser Valley. And these are always having a number die. And at the moment, we haven't yet come to the conclusion that we should be feeding any of this or making it available to things like eagles. What we do with the dead animals, we bundle it up every week and we send it to Alberta in trucks to be burned in the tar sands. Isn't that incredible?
Oh my goodness, right.
Yes. So we've taken away their salmon, we've taken away their garbage, and while there's a lot of other food out here, we take that and we send it to the tar sands to be burned.
Is there any, David? Just an interesting question here. I mean, if let's say we were to do that, similar to the way we used to have vultures around, right? To get rid of the carcasses, would it actually be hygienically sustainable if we did that? If we just left cows outside, would it be possible in your opinion?
Well, yes. I mean, for one thing, we didn't have a lot of vultures here. We've just started to get turkey vultures here. just started in the last few years. They are not historically a
Right.
long-term
Okay.
bird from here. We don't even get black vultures. There used to be, we believe, some records of California condors here, but we don't think they were ever huge numbers. So, but you're quite right, and it's my feeling, and it's about to be a proposal that I've been working up towards, and one of these big films that you and I went to Japan to film some of the chapters on this 2 years ago, but COVID has put a 2-year delay on this film. The option will be how does an area come up with a big food supply to replace something that historically has always been there? And I think we have that food supply here. It's in the cattle industry. It would be very simple to make these cows available throughout the valley. I mean, in certain areas, I mean, you don't want it everywhere, but there could be a half a dozen good feeding places, just like there's only a half a dozen or 15 really major places where there's good salmon, historical salmon numbers. Some of those are on Vancouver Island. So we can simply substitute those sites with what is now being wasted, the dead calves and so on. It's a logical thing to do, because we are responsible for keeping for 5 to 6, 7 months all those northern eagles, but we've taken away their food supply. What are we going to give them in return?
Yeah, that's a very good point, David. So you were out in the flooded area yesterday and so on, and you said you observed something. You suddenly saw, I think, salmon or fish in areas you've never seen them before. Can you just tell us what you saw?
Well, it's a I don't want to say it's a funny thing. It's a sad
No,
thing.
it's a sad thing.
Funny
Yes.
is sometimes you say the word
I
funny
know,
and you
I
mean
know. Yes.
unusual and
Yeah.
in a sense sad. But when all these dikes broke, water came rushing in, it is right at the season when all the salmon are in these rivers to spawn. And so what has happened is there are salmon that broke through these dikes and are now sitting out in the middle of farmers' fields. And as the water is pumped out, these salmon carcasses are going to be available for the eagles, and because they're just going to be sitting out in the middle of a pasture, and they're going to be dead, of course, and they're not going to have effectively spawned out there either, because there's no proper spawning channels where they're going to stay wet and the young hatchlings could get back into a river. That's all finished. So there will be, and we have no idea yet what the numbers of these spawned out salmon that are in the farmer fields. But there's quite a few square miles of farmer fields. So there could be a few thousands of carcasses, which over the next 2 weeks, when they drain these fields, could become a winter food for this year's bald eagles. We just don't know yet. We just don't know yet. I suspect eagles are really clever and they're very adaptable. And if there are salmon carcasses out there, they absolutely will find them. We just know that they will find them. That's what they are. They're scavengers. They're not, at this time of year, half the year, the eagles are not hunters. They're scavengers.
And we had a very good salmon run this year, didn't we?
We had a few salmon. Some runs had certain parts of their runs that were okay, but still most of the rivers are down. They're down 60%. The runs that did return are about 30% what they are supposed to be. But so there were a few rivers that had reasonable runs for some of the runs. I see a river coming down a valley can have maybe 6 or 8 or 10 different salmon runs. They could be of all 5 species of salmon, but some come in early and spawn. Genetically, another group doesn't spawn till 6 weeks later. They come in 6 weeks later and spawn. Some rivers will have 8 and 10 different spawning populations of salmon. And this is what makes them very, very vulnerable to being wiped out by the fishermen. A seine boat can run a big seine and collect 20,000 pounds of salmon.
Mm-hmm.
And most of that 20,000 pounds is a group of salmon that came from a certain river, because they hatch out together, they stay together as fingerlings and bigger, they grow together, they stay together until they return 4 years later to the same river. But if a seine boat runs a net around it, they can take out every potential breeding salmon from maybe 200 meters of a river.
Yes.
So
Yes.
the fishermen can actually eliminate very quickly
Right.
the spawning of the total spawning of some rivers. And this is, of course, precisely what has happened.
Yeah, Diane is also asking, what about the land animals? How are they faring with the floods? Bear, deer, possum, etc. David.
Yeah, well, many animals have great deals of difficulty. If you're out in the floodplains and you were a land mammal, if you were a big land mammal, an elk or deer, you might have been able to walk out of it and go 4 miles and get to the side hill.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a raccoon, maybe you're up a tree somewhere and you're going to be stuck up that tree for 2 weeks until you can get back down again, or maybe you can come down and swim to the next tree or something. And if you're a rodent, a small mammal, you're probably going to drown. I mean, many of them will. I mean, every fall, I live on a farm. So every fall, as soon as the rains come in 1st September, we get inundated with mice and voles and rats. They all get forced out of the lower country because it's flooded.
Yes.
And they all move up the slope. And we live at the top of the hill. So we get all of these every fall. And of course, following them come the mink and occasionally the little short-tailed weasel,
Mm-hmm.
and the hawks. That they are looking for these displaced small rodents.
Right.
So, there's a balance. Every year there's a balance on how this one group helps feed the other. But when you get a catastrophic thing, a huge change, particularly man-induced, and in this case the Sumas River or the Sumas Lake was drained by man, so man changed that whole ecosystem, and now, of course, nature is back and flooded it, and of course that's changed it again. But that's going to be temporary. That change, going back to what used to be, is going to be very, very brief, because farmers want to have their land back. There was a huge scream here a few days ago. It was suggested that 7 of the farms would be permanently abandoned.
Right. Right.
And those families have lived there for 100 years in many cases, different generations of them. They screamed and hollered, and they demanded that they get their property back and that we drain it and so on. But of course, it's all artificial farmland. We created it for them.
We created it now, right. David, another question here from Klingen Warbird on YouTube. With all the dead salmon and they can't spawn, doesn't that mean that in future there won't be as many salmon? That's a good point.
Absolutely.
It's a good point.
Sure. I mean, a salmon can have 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 eggs in it.
Mm-hmm.
So every time you lose a salmon, you're losing 3,000, 4,000 potential fry. But of course, many things eat the fry, from hatching on through when they come back to the river 4 years later and make the great sacrifice, spawn and die again. So, but under the normal circumstance, lots of fish come back, lots of fish breed and produce more food. I mean, the cycle has been terrible on the long-term productivity of salmon. I mean, we've over-harvested so many rivers. So many rivers no longer have any salmon in them. I mean, they've just been overfished. This has affected not just our human ability to harvest it, but it's affected the orcas. I mean, one group of the orcas, the killer whales, just live on salmon.
Right.
And they prefer to have spring salmon, the big, and those are the orcas that in my very first aerial surveys of them in the 50s, when I did a count, I was out looking for eagles, and I counted 295 breeding orcas in a big pod. I didn't even know that there was such a thing as JKL pods. We hadn't
Really?
determined
Okay.
that. Well, that hadn't
Okay.
been found out
Uh-huh.
yet, but I counted about 295. Those we now know were the JKL pods, of which there's now struggling to have 70 animals. And, it's worried that they're all going to die out. So the other transient orcas, the ones that are living on sea lions, they're doing much better. But the salmon feeding orcas, well, we've overharvested the salmon. So we've taken the food away from the orcas as well. And of course, we've taken by overharvesting not just the salmon, but the herring. The herring is the other huge, most wasteful fishery on the entire coast of North America is the herring fishery. And we still allow some of it to happen because the Japanese pay so much for herring eggs. And we've lost the big amounts of herring spawn. And there's millions of tons. There should have been millions and millions of tons of herring, because they feed not only little fishes, but they feed the halibut, they feed the cod, they feed the seals, the sea lions, they feed the salmon, they feed the seabirds, they feed the eagles. I mean, when you take away something as important as the herring, you've decimated so much of everything else. That's the problem. But we're good at that. We latch onto the fact that we make a quick buck by selling a few herring eggs, and to hell with everything else. Yeah. And we're paying the price.
David, I have to ask you one important question. That's what I would ask David Attenborough too, because in all the decades of your experience with wildlife, looking at the crisis that we've gone through in our area, we've gone through devastating wildfires on the Pacific Northwest. Now we're seeing floods. We're seeing more and more of these sort of almost tropical rainfalls happening. Do you think there's such a thing as global warming? I'm glad you're laughing, but that's good.
You say that with a tongue in cheek.
Of course,
but
of course I know. But I'm asking this as a from your experience.
So I'm going to say two things. First, I'm going to say yes. So blood, obviously, but I want to say something else. In 1953, when I was 15, when I was flying hawks and learning to be a falconer and so on, and I had an eagle, I then first met David Attenborough's films on my television. I mean, that's what it was then that I decided to be a wildlife photographer and a biologist. And so I have a long affinity to David Attenborough. And so one of these films, we did a big film with him a few years ago, and one of the ones I'm putting together right now is hopefully going to be for the BBC. And I'm hoping we don't get another delay with another couple of years of COVID, that I can get it before David and I both go on to something else in our existence. So, yeah, obviously he has followed this even slightly longer than I have. And all these impacts, the degradation of fish, the degradation of everything, of forests, the pollution of the atmosphere, all of these things, these human disruptions of the normal systems, these are all what has brought about this change in atmospheric conditions. And it's causing a huge shift. I mean, people say it's only a degree or 2 degrees.
That's what they say, yes. That's right.
Huge shift in how the world responds to a degree of temperature. And we're beginning to see those degrees. I mean, we have got the most water. I mean, you hit it off the top here. It was incredible. We went through months of drought in parts of British Columbia this year, then forest fires. Now we're going through months of floods. I mean, everything is an extreme.
Yes.
We either get no water or we get too much. And these are the kinds of impacts, these extreme violences that come from this climatic change that is being imposed upon us because of the thinning of the atmosphere and conversion of proper compounds of oxygen and CO2. We're changing it to the wrong way. you're quite right. I mean, as David has pointed out, we have to get the world back to a saner place. Otherwise, there won't be any world 25, 50 more years from now, or at least not a world for humans. We're pushing it so violently
So
today.
on a positive note, how would you do it?
Well, there's a lot of people who really have spent a lifetime
Hmm.
discussing this, but it's making renewable resources renewable rather than forcing an ecosystem to produce one thing and
Yeah.
one thing only. I mean, this is what we do,
Hmm.
we tend to do. We find out that by converting thousands of square miles of forest, we can get and create an industry of building houses from lumber. But we don't look at the long term impact of removal of all those trees. What has that done to the ecosystem? We move into an area and we say, oh my God, we could cut down all those trees and we could grow farmland, or we could drain a lake and grow farm. But you can't keep doing that. It doesn't work. It's such a limited aspect of what we're producing. We're just producing food or something for us. We're not thinking of the balance of nature. That's what keeps the system in balance, is the fact that there's a great, huge variety of living things. We use up oxygen, but there are green plants and green algae and so on that produce that are necessary to produce the oxygen. It doesn't come from anywhere else. It comes from green plants.
Yeah, Kathy has a very interesting question in this regard. Do you think global warming with slightly rising temperatures will affect eggs and make them non-viable? That's a great question, actually. Yeah.
Well, sure. I mean, it doesn't matter whether,
What?
well, I'm an ornithologist, as you know. I'm a bird person, but I'm involved and sit on several committees to do with
Yes.
fish. Eggs are equally sensitive to temperatures for hatching
Yes.
as bird eggs are. I mean, bird eggs often have to be kept within 2 or 3 degrees for whatever the days are. I mean, in eagles, it's 36, 7 days to hatch. They've got to be kept at the same temperature. They can go down and up a little bit for a few hours when the female is not incubating or something, but they have to keep their eggs at a fairly constant rate. Fish eggs in a river are really susceptible to this, because if a river doesn't get enough water and enough cool water, it just heats up very quickly. Well, then within hours, all the salmon eggs are dead. Or if they've just hatched, all the little fry and fingerlings can't make it either. Or maybe it's what happens is that the eggs and the insect larvae can't survive either. Well, it's the insect larvae that they're going to feed the young salmon. So, everything is related.
Yes.
And
And
so
they
when we just, yeah,
and David, I can add something very practical that we both experienced just at the end of June or beginning of July when you visited me in the Okanagan, right? So east of
yeah,
Vancouver, when we went through this devastating heat, and we know that the raptor body temperatures are around 41 degrees Celsius, which corresponds to about 105 to 106 Fahrenheit. That when we go above this temperature, they have a lot of problems with cooling, right? And we were looking at the osprey nests, and I don't remember how many, 14 or 15 nests we looked, and we only found
yeah,
one occupied, right?
yeah.
So
Same thing happened down here. Owl, the big rehab
yes.
center, this year, I think I have it right, got in 65
Ah, yes,
eaglets that
yes,
came out of nests. And
yes.
every year they always get a few, but nothing like they got this year. And it's believed that these birds were heat stressed sitting
He's
up in the
stressed, yes,
sun,
yes, yes.
and they were trying to flap their wings and walking to get, and they simply walked off, either delirious, walked off the edge of the nest and came down. And of course, if they didn't have any feathers on their wings, they died. They went to the ground. But some of them, uh, as they got bigger, put their wings out as they're falling, and made it to the ground. And some of those have been survived, been released. In fact, we've just put trackers on about 8 of those ones from Vancouver area. And if people go to our website and look at our trackers, we've got young eaglets this year that were released here, and in a few, I don't want to say hours, but in 2 to 3 days, the birds are already in Alaska. They got the hell out of down here. They knew to get up somewhere that's a little cooler.
That's the advantage of flying, right? That's
Yes, yes. And in 2 to 3 days, these birds are already 1,000 miles north of here, or 700 miles north on a nice, cool river. Yeah, it's amazing how quickly, if you give these birds a chance, and that, of course, if they went to owl, they already were basically wipeout. They failed the first time, but they were given a second chance from the rehab center, and lo and behold, owl gets to not just rehab them, but release them, and then we were able to put markers on them, colored bands and trackers. And now we get to find out what they're really doing for the rest of their time and the rest of the life of the tracker. One of the things, as soon as this program is over, I have to go and take $15,000 from the bank and send it to our tracker manufacturer because he's holding up the next shipment until I do that. I forgot to send him the last money.
David, maybe we can end off with one question, getting right back to the original Sumas lake and the mosquitoes, actually, which I found so interesting, the story. I mean, we all, I wouldn't know anybody who loves mosquitoes, so I can sympathize with them saying, get rid of the mosquitoes. At the same time, I'm a bit surprised. Don't the birds who eat these mosquitoes, don't they get stung themselves, or how do they survive? Are they immune, or how does that work?
I think when a bird, even a little chick, snaps a mosquito, there's not much left of the mosquito to fight back. I mean,
yeah, but they come all over you.
You
it's like me hitting. I can't hit fast enough. I'll get stung, right? So I'm just wondering, whatever they eat is a small fraction of what they're going to be stung with, or how does it work?
All the shorebirds of North America that come out of the Arctic, all the young ducks, geese, and swan, the smallest of the, that's what they are eating is mosquito larvae.
Amazing, amazing.
The whole population largely depends upon. I mean, some of the bigger things that when you get to be a swan, a young swan, and you get over a pound or so, then you start to convert from larvae to eating of willow and other floating algae and so on. But for many of the creatures, the basic protein source that sustains northern creatures is really mosquito larvae or mosquitoes themselves. So it's quite incredible the important role that mosquito plays in sustaining so many of the birds that we don't even think of as eating them, because as an adult, they don't get to eat many of them.
Yeah, David Howden, very nice that he always comes on the show too. He has a good question here. I don't know if we know this already. Did the trackers show anything about how the birds responded to the flooding, actually? Do we know anything about the birds in this area? Have we checked that?
Our trackers, the eagles so far have not really responded to the flooding area because it's not dry yet. I mean, the eagle is dependent upon finding the carcasses of these dead salmon.
Right.
And normally at this season of the year, they'd be along the gravel bars because the salmon have just been dying they're spawned out and they die following spawning. And their carcasses drift downstream until they get hung up on a gravel bar. And then the eagles over the next 3 or 4 months, sometimes they're in deep pockets in the river, and they'll go in, wade in, and grab the fish and pull them to the shore. And after the fish has been dead for 2 or 3 months, it's amazing. They're almost jelly inside the skin, but the eagles still get good protein out of it. So what's going to happen, I think, at the moment, is that when the floodwaters of all these farmlands are pumped out and they dry out, there will be, hopefully, in this case, hopefully, the carcasses of salmon that will be found by the eagles. I mean, whether there's huge numbers or just a few thousand, I don't know yet. There's bound to be a number of them because we see them you can see some of them already in the fields.
Yes.
I mean, swimming around. They've been spotted crossing some of the roads. Salmon crossing the roads. I mean, it's a funny sight. But when the water goes, they're just going to have to die out, and they will then their carcasses will then be available to eagles if they haven't moved on.
And David, maybe the final question I would like to ask you, Heather, if you had to, from all the wisdom that you have gathered in your life, especially about wildlife, can you give 1 or 2 sentences of advice to future generations? What would you say to them if someone asked you, well, what shall we do?
There's only one real thing. It's so bloody simple, Christian.
Okay, go ahead.
Don't breed. The problem for the entire world is there's too damn many people.
Right.
That's the one and only major problem of the world. There's far, far, far too many people everywhere.
True.
So don't breed. Have fun pretending, but don't produce
Okay.
more bloody humans. That's
Right.
what the problem
Right.
is. It's not the wild, it's the humans and how we totally disrupt nature. That's the problem is. There's not enough food resources to be effectively distributed to the number of people we have on the earth today, let alone more. So quit breeding.
Well,
So simple.
Okay, there you go. Well, that's a very clear message, and I don't think that many people would give that type of message. So,
well, it's the problem, Christian, and nobody wants to talk about it. It's the elephant in the room. It's the fact that people want to keep having kids. They don't need to have more kids. Have fewer kids. That's what it's all about. Have fewer kids.
Okay. So thank you very much, David, on that word of wisdom. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. So if you've been wondering why I'm always looking down, I'm trying to get all your messages and questions in at the same time. So I apologize for not always looking straight ahead, but I'm also doing this on a separate channel, just for those who are wondering why I don't have that on another screen, is because it disrupts the flow and it can give audio problems. That's why I'm doing this all on a separate screen, so you understand. Anyway, next week we'll be back again with the Humans and Wildlife show. Georgia will be back from Chile, so you can go in the replay and see what the words she said in the beginning. She's sending you all her warmest regards, and we'll be on again next week. I don't exactly know what the topic is going to be, but I can promise it's going to be interesting, and I would really like to thank all of you for your interest, and please pass on David's wisdom to others. Thank you. Thank you, David, for being here.
And don't you go laughing about that wisdom. That is the answer to the world's problem. It is such a simple thing, and people don't want to talk about it. We're always so concerned with our own personal greed that there's too many people, and we just have to cut back having more.